With that, it is my pleasure to welcome today's keynote speaker. The Grugq is Vice President of Threat Intelligence at COME. He's a pioneering information researcher with 2 decades of experience. Having worked extensively with threat intelligence, digital forensics analysis, binary reverse engineering toolkits, mobile phone security, voice over IP, telecommunications, and financial services security. We invited the Grugq today to speak at Black Hat for his unique perspective on the new dimension of cyber conflict today. So please join me in welcoming the Grugq.
All right, good morning. It is about 4 hours before I normally get up, so let's see how we do. I am going to do a very, very short discussion on cyber conflict, which is a very, very large topic. So we'll see how that goes. I'm going to try and get it to significantly under the 1 hour that we have, but who knows. So this outline is actually not at all related to the outline of the presentation, but it is the 3 key takeaways I want you guys to get, which is that cyber is a new dimension. The interesting thing about cyber is not computers, but actually people and information. And cyber is Calvin ball. You cannot play it the same way twice. So about me, not much to say. I've been here long enough to become a thought leader, which is, it is what it is, I guess. So very, very briefly, what I want to do is I want to cover the fundamentals of conflict, which I'm sure you're all fascinated by. So the main things with conflict is that what you want to do is you want to have an advantage over your opponent, and you want to have them at a disadvantage. Historically, that's come through what's called dislocation, where you try and disrupt your adversary to put them at a disadvantage and to give you an advantage. When dislocation fails, you end up with confrontation, which is where you do strength on strength, and that's not ideal because that's a complete gamble. And because there's this dynamic where basically your adversary doesn't have to do what you want them to do, and in fact are trying to get the advantage on you and put you at a disadvantage at the same time that you're trying to do that. What you end up is with this balance. This dynamic nature means that sometimes you'll have confrontation, sometimes there'll be dislocation, sometimes you have advantage, sometimes you don't. That's basically how it works. So a brief history of war. For quite a long time, there were only 2 places you could wage war, which was on land or on sea. So those are the first 2 dimensions, 1D and 2D they get called. So with land conflict, essentially advantage or disadvantage had primarily to do with either overwhelming technological advantage, which tended not to happen very much, and was instead primarily a matter of location, being to the rear or to the side of your opponent, or just massively outnumbering them. And the ultimate balance of this ended up being what got called maneuver warfare. So the other domain was sea. Sea was frequently used just to get from point A to point B to then do land war. However, if you did do conflict at sea, what you wanted to do is this thing, which is called crossing the T. That's where your forces can bring more firepower to bear on the enemy. This was actually considered a secret tactic. Like everyone that figured this out tried to keep it secret, but it was understood fairly rapidly because everyone figured out the tactic at pretty much the same time. And again, the techniques of dislocation tended to be overwhelming, so having more, or being able to cross the T, which has happened twice in history, and very, very occasionally tech. And due to the comma, I assume I had another thought, but I don't know what the hell it is. So, and therefore something else. So anyway, so that was it for thousands of years. And then suddenly we started getting new domains really, really rapidly. And those new domains are interesting because what you had was the first one was air, which came about 100 years ago. Then there was space, which is called 4D, and cyber, which is called 5D. And what's interesting about these is that they've happened so rapidly that there's only really been one domain in which we've been able to see the full development of like initial theory, praxis, development of grand strategy, development of strategy, and advancement across all of these different ways in which it could work, and then actually trying it out. In space, there hasn't really been conflict. Like we only use it for spying, so it's not that interesting. Cyber, we're actually so early on that we're not seeing the development of theory in the same way that we saw after the first air wars. So I'm going to repeat everything I just said, only with more pictures. So as I said, the first new domain was air war, which, you know, we've got this awesome picture. And what was fascinating about air war was it literally opened up a new dimension. So you went from being in front or behind or to the sides to being above or below your opponent, as well as everywhere else. So it was literally 3D. And that brought us to these weird innovations where, if we're lucky, the playing thing will wait. No, video? No such luck. Oh well, fuck it. So this is an awesome video, and you're all losing out. Oh, there we go. Awesome. Okay, so this is called the immoral turn. And what happens is he comes in, he dives, he attacks, then he pulls up, stalls, swings over to the side, and then when he comes down again, he's now facing the other way, and he can dive back again at his opponent. And the reason that this was invented was the plane that he was using, the Fokker Eindecker, completely sucked. So you saw when he was looking to the sides that the wings didn't have airfoils, like ailerons. It did wing warping, so it twisted the wing to turn, which meant that you couldn't actually do a tight turn. So if you did a dive on someone, you couldn't swing around. So he had to come up with this hack. Like, this was literally a hack to get around the fact that the plane that he had sucked. And it was a really bad hack because for most of the part of this, when you're pulling up and when you're stalling out and then twisting over, you're completely vulnerable. And actually, Immelman died at the height of one of these when he got shot in the head, because his plane stalls out and he's just kind of sitting there as an easy target. So it was a very, very bad hack, but it's the sort of thing that you could never imagine if you only understood land war, right? If you asked an admiral sort of how to do air war, they would think, oh, well, you know, we need to figure out how we can cross the T in the air, right? Like, how do we get our guys to bring most of their turrets to bear on the adversary? And it's like, well, you can't, because that doesn't make any sense at all. That's not how it works. And I think there's a similar conceptual problem going on where you've got people who are trying to use analogy to understand this new dimension, where what you really need is people who are native to this new dimension, who have an in-depth, concrete understanding of how it works. So during the air war, what was interesting was there was this early theory about how you would create advantage, and the theory was if you had the best and most skillful pilots, then what you needed was a plane that would allow them to express themselves best, so highly maneuverable, and then you could get in these sort of jousts one-on-one pilot competition, and the most skilled pilot would win. And it turns out that that's bullshit. Actually, the most skilled pilot doesn't win, because the way that you win is you show up with 20 guys, you come up from above and behind who you're attacking, and you dive on him in force. And you overwhelm by volume and by positioning. And so it's somewhat similar to cyber in that a lot of us who grew up with cyber were big on like skills as a main thing, whereas in practice, you're getting huge companies owned by a bunch of Muppets running poison ivy with word macros for attacks. Like, it's not about skill. It turns out that that doesn't actually matter, right? Like WikiLeaks is a website, and it helped defeat an entire billion-dollar campaign. That's not a skill thing, right? Like, there's no, like, editing HTML is not like some advanced cyber technique, right? But it was a use of cyber as an attack domain. So we tend to get things very, very wrong because we're very egocentric and think, all right, it's going to be a high-skill competition, and it usually never is. Like, if you're getting in a battle of skill, it means you've lost. Right? It means you're down to a confrontation of a strength on strength, and that's completely wrong, which is literally what I just said on this slide. Right, moving on. So the other interesting thing about air war is how it started out being primarily used for reconnaissance and spying, and then started getting used for attack. And then finally for strategic attack. And I have an amusing anecdote, which I do not have time for. However, bear in mind that the reason that floppy caps became popular was initially everyone had these round caps like you see with the North Koreans, big round thing. Turns out that if you take a photo of that from the air, it becomes very, very easy to count enemy strength because you just count the circles. So everyone took the wire out of their hats to make them floppy, which made it a lot harder to count. And then that's why floppy hats got popular. Right. So this was the first book that existed which dealt with trying to develop a strategy or a theory of air war. And it was called Air Power. And because I'm a genius and I didn't put my notes up here, I forget the guy's name, but it's some Italian dude. And anyway, like what I find so interesting is that you could literally take the first paragraph and you can just replace aeronautics with cyber, and it's literally now, right? Like you could simply replace the domain and say, this is what's happening. I'm going to skip space and I'm going to go straight to cyber, because the dimension of cyber is very, very interesting, and that is because it adds another dimension, one that allows you to be not only above or behind or to the sides, but you could literally be inside your adversary, observing what they do and changing what they do, right? You could monitor their command and control. So that brings me to this thing of like, this cyber is a new dimension. It's literally an entirely new dimension. And that's very, very interesting because basically dimensions are useful in the ways that they intersect with reality, where all of us are. So I'm going to use these very, very advanced graphics to get my point across. So imagine you live on like 1D land, right? This is the dude with a one-dimensional view. And if you take a sphere and you intersect that sphere with a 1D at just one point, then from the point of view of 1D man, he doesn't see a sphere, he sees a point. So he thinks that what he's observing is a point, instead of what's actually going on is that there's a sphere. If you intersect it all the way, what he's going to see is a line, right? It's going to appear as a line. If he could move to 2D, he would be able to see a circle. But really, this is 3D, it's a sphere. It's much more complicated than any of the things that he has conceptualized beforehand. So, as I said, the reason why understanding this as a dimension is relevant is that Dimensions are relevant in that they intersect with reality in a number of ways. And cyber has primarily 4 different intersections with reality. There's active, passive, physical, and cognitive. And active is where you have a direct ability to manipulate information, or where you can, like where we physically interact by popping a shell on a box, I would call active. Where you modify things, I would call that active. So one of the classic examples of this is when the Unit 8200 was fighting with the PLO. They broke into the computers that we used to conduct all the finances, and they transferred money around to make it appear as if there was deep corruption and people were siphoning money to each other. And this worked because there was an extent of corruption, so everyone believed that there was even more corruption than they were aware of, and it caused some degradation of capability with the PLO, but it was kind of badly placed, because at that point what they should have done is been building up the PLO so that they had something to fight Hamas. Anyway, hindsight. The other intersection is passive, and I'm sure you've never seen this before, but passive is the ability to just monitor what's going on in the cyber domain, and it tends not to have any interaction with things. So this is quite interesting, but it's also not the end-all and be-all. And the problem for the US is they've gotten very, very hooked on passive. This is why they always complain about going dark and so on. And then there is physical, where actually cyber stuff can interact and interfere with physical things in real life. The classical example would be Stuxnet, where you had something physically destroying hardware. There's this one which I like, which is a fortune cookie segfault. And the last one is cognitive, which is really weird, because it doesn't seem like it should work, but it does, right? Like simply providing information to people shouldn't really be an attack, but it is, because the ability to modify people's behavior with information is very, very old. Propaganda, marketing, all of this is based on the idea of modifying people's behavior with information. And for some reason, this came as a complete shock to everyone in 2016, where information was used to modify people's behavior. Like, who could have ever fucking imagined, right? What are the odds? And yeah, it's interesting because people do things like, oh, as long as fake news, disinformation, misinformation, blah blah blah, and it's actually not that important. Like, using lies is not critical to modify people's behavior. You can use the truth, right? Like, COINTELPRO was destroyed by the revelation that it existed, and that was all true, right? That wasn't a cyber attack. That was a straightforward, they burgled an office, stole data, and released it to the media, and it caused the end of that program, right? So that was the use of purely factual information to cause a modification in the real world. And the idea that you can only cause a modification in the real world with falsified or untrue information is wrong. You can use truth. Which brings us to our next thing, which is that cyber is not really about computers. Like, computers are just a way of getting people and information together, or of being able to interact with the real world. But cyber is actually about people and information. And what that means is that your ability to be good at cyber actually depends a huge amount on your bureaucracy. Right? Bureaucracy is what allows you to have your teams operate at maximum efficiency. And this becomes very, very weird, because no one ever thinks having good bureaucracy is fundamental to having a good cyber capability, but it actually is. And to quote Maritain, bureaucracy is hard, right? You tend to get things that just don't quite work exactly. Like for each person involved, it makes complete sense. However, holistically, it is broken. And I just like the picture. So when you think about it, like, how does that impact it? And that's because you need to have teams. Like teams are what allow you to do cyber. It's possible to do with individuals, but individuals, if they make mistakes, that's kind of it. So if we look at it, what are the factors that impact the capability of a team? It's adaptability, which is sort of how well you can adjust. There's agility, which is how rapidly you can change to things. There's speed, which is how fast you can go from an idea to an execution. There's creativity, which is how good you are at innovation or combining techniques or coming up with new ones. And then there's cohesion, which is sort of how well your teams collectively work together, individually work together, and how well they follow the will of the executive. So Dave Vitale called these meta, which is basically different organizational strategies. I won't spend huge amounts of time reading all of that, but basically you have mega teams, which is what the US does, where you have these very, very huge teams of operators, and that kind of sucks. There's where instead of a mega team, you have a team that just operates an automated attack suite, and that's got limitations. You have using worms as a sort of one-shot attack, and you have the approach which I really like, which is you have a large number of small teams with a range of capabilities. So mega teams gets you this sort of thing, where you've got a whole bunch of people where you, in order to have, say, 1,000 operators, you either can have a high level of skill and a small number of operators, or a low level of skill and a large number of operators, and then you have to put all of your skill focus into the tooling that they use, which is what tends to happen. The downside of that, of course, is that once you've put everything into your tools, and if you're like any organization, you end up with a procurement life cycle where you have to say, here are the requirements, here's our budget, here's where we're going to deploy, here's how we have to do our training, here's how we're going to do our maintenance and keeping it going. And then you've sunk a huge amount of money into this thing. And that means that you probably keep it around a lot longer than you need to, because you end up with the sunk cost fallacy until someone does something polite, like dumping all of your shit on the internet during the middle of an election and burning it all, and then you have to rapidly retool in the middle of a war, and that can kind of suck. And one of the ways around that is by having a small team in large quantities. That way, any attack against tooling will disable one team, but not all of them. The other one is you can do the sort of managed worms approach, which I think is expensive, fragile, specialized, and it's basically just weaponized copy pasta from Stack Overflow. So I don't think it's a good approach. Using one-shot worms can work, but it gets you things like NotPetya, which get out of control and can lead to some embarrassment, like when you take out Durex condom development for several months. Like, that was probably not the intended point of releasing NotPetya against Ukraine, but that happened. So I like having a lot of small teams. I think that having a lot of small teams gives you a range of capacity, so you can end up with like your super elite, like amazing stuff that comes in and like no one knows what's going on and they disappear. And then you could have, your other capacity, which is sending 2,000 phishing emails with a macro-enabled Word doc saying, this has been encrypted, please press enable content to decrypt me. And because you have this large number of teams, you have a large amount of capacity. And I really, really like that approach. I think it's quite good. The US doesn't like it because it means that you would have to enable a lot of autonomy and you'd have to push down authority to smaller groups, which is not good for empire building. And it's also a problem because you would have to involve the civilian sector, which is not a thing that they do in the US. They don't allow civilians to get involved in hacking stuff. They put them in jail if they do that. So that is a problem, and the US cannot do it. So as I said, you've got adaptability, agility, speed, creativity, cohesion. So as I said, adaptability is like the ability to take a new technology and exploit it for cyber conflict. So it's your ability to take something, figure out, oh, right, this is cool, Facebook, we can weaponize this, and then to do so, right? And while the US has proven itself very, very good at developing new technologies, they have been fairly poor at adapting those technologies for offensive purposes. Agility is sort of the ability to take where you are and to make it where you want to be. Right? So the classic example I like for this is Gusoff 2, where basically their operation got blown completely. And despite it getting blown completely, within a few hours, they had turned this collection operation into an influence operation, into an info war attack. So GRU hacked the NC, they were monitoring and collecting stuff. It got reported in the Washington Post. Less than 24 hours later, Gusoff 2 has appeared and has already started releasing content and confusing things. So this was the ability to take a changing situation and adapt to it very, very rapidly. Right? They're very, very agile. There is almost no organization that can take a failed project and turn it into a completely different, new, successful project in a different domain in less than 12 hours. Like, that's amazing. And you can only really do that if you've got the bureaucratic space to maneuver like that. So as I said, bureaucracy, key enabler. Speed is essentially the ability to go from the concept of an attack to the actual implementation. So one of the ways that you can measure speed is the number of meetings before someone can hit enter, right? So the smaller the number of meetings, the faster you're going. In the US, in some cases, it can take up to 9 meetings before someone can hit enter, which is very, very slow. Right? You're not going to do that in 12 hours. Creativity is, as I said, it's a sort of innovation. It's the ability to take things that exist or to create new things or to find new attacks or approaches. And you have more chance of fostering creativity if you've got a large number of small teams, because innovations that happen in one team will diffuse to the other teams. There's less likely to be groupthink. There's more likely to be within those individual teams, because there's competition between them, of course, there's more likely to be innovation because they're going to be trying to outcompete each other. So generally speaking, in terms of creativity, I think you're better off with having small teams, because you can have small teams of very, very smart people and their ideas will diffuse out to everyone else. Or you could do this and just copy whatever it says on the manual. And cohesion is basically how well your groups cooperate, as well as if your groups follow the will of the executive very, very closely. And that comes up because in the US, for example, there's quite close control. Like the executive will lay out, here's the rules, these are the laws, this is what you're allowed to do. This is what we want you to do. And the US organizations will do exactly that. In other countries, it will be a lot looser. It will be sort of like, if you find something interesting, let us know. It will be, if you get around to it, this is kind of what we're looking for. So, over the next 5 years, our focus is going to be on AI and biotech. And then teams will go out and focus on that. And so when you issue the command like, all right, everyone stop doing that, we're not hacking so much anymore, it takes a little while for those teams to rein in because it's very, very loose. So it depends a lot on the approach. I think that you want somewhere in the middle, like a happy medium. Like if it's too close to the will of the executive, then it's not creative enough and it's not pushing boundaries enough. Whereas if it's too loose, then you have you have no control and no idea of what's going on. So if we talk about teams, we've got like the Bears, and the Bears as a team, here we go. It's complicated. So the Bears have a wide range of private organizations and public state intelligence organizations and also military intelligence organizations. And because of this diversity, they have a huge amount of innovation. They do not have excellent cohesion, particularly at the edges with the civilian stuff. But they've got a lot of other cool stuff going on. One of them is that they have freedom to fail, which I think is a massively important issue that the US has missed out on, which is that you need your teams to be able to screw up because that's how life works. Like, people make mistakes. You need that to be a possibility, and that is a possibility in Russia. And that's great, because you learn a lot from mistakes that you don't learn from successes. So they've got like formal and informal. So informal is basically the criminals can sell anything they find from botnets. Because they allow them to operate, they don't have to pay all of their operators. They can simply let them earn money on their own. So they have like all of this great stuff going on for them, and it's very, very impressive, particularly their agility and their speed. And part of that comes down to, like with military intelligence, a good plan violently executed now is better than the perfect plan next week, right? Like these dudes are like, you know what, close enough, fucking go for it, right? And that's how you get Gusoff 2 being able to get stood up in 12 hours, right? How you're able to rapidly respond because you're like, you know what, this is pretty much what we want to do, let's just do it. If you took a week before you responded, it wouldn't have been as effective, even if it didn't have so much sloppiness about it, right? Like the sloppiness turned out not to be an issue because they were able to confuse things so much that now there's people who are literally like, yes, just this morning, Gusoff 2 had an IP address traced back to GRU headquarters, right? So there's already people going like, wow, like, has no one heard of IP spoofing? It's like, you fucking morons. Like, everyone knew it was GRU. Like, there's no question about it from day one. Like, how dumb do you have to be to remain convinced of, like, your own bizarre version of events? But people are committed to it now, right? It's become part of their identity, and because of that, they refuse to believe any sort of external evidence, and it's awesome. And it proves that simply coming up with something and committing to it quickly can beat coming up with a perfect option. Next one is going to be 5i. Represented here by a whole bunch of people having tea next to a tank that's fallen over. And the history of how Five Eye got how it is actually very, very interesting. So basically, in the 90s, after the Cold War was over, you had all of these very, very large intelligence organizations with big budgets who were facing the axe because the Cold War was over and no one needed them. So they were quite desperate to come up with justification for more budget and why they should stick around. And one of the things that came up was NSA, they monitored radio transmission. And they could see the writing was on the wall. Radio was not the thing anymore. Like, that was kind of going out of fashion, right? So they were trying to take over cyber, whereas CIA was like, hey, like our job is to steal secrets. The difference between a safe and a computer is nothing. That's where the secrets are. We should own that. And so they tried to set up this sort of like joint cyber operations center, and NSA said, fuck you guys. We do signal intelligence, and computers is just signals intelligence before it gets signaled. So they invented the concept called SIGINT at rest, right? So it was basically SIGINT before it gets sent out. So they took over the whole thing by just bringing their huge existing budget and manpower to bear on it, and they stole it from CIA. And CIA is still actually pissed off about this 20-something years later, right? And CIA tried to respond by saying, actually, it's not SIGINT at rest, it's HUMINT in motion, which brings this awesome little slide that someone put together for me where, cyber. It's not SIGINT at rest, it's HUMINT in motion. But because NSA took over all of cyber, and NSA's mission is basically just to passively monitor what's going on, it meant that, generally speaking, all of the cyber stuff that was being done by the US was focused on monitoring. And that came down as well to the way that the US divides authority to be able to do things. So Title 50 covers all of espionage, and that is what NSA does. They do espionage, they monitor and they learn information. All of the information operations was PSYOPs, and that was basically given over to the military because it got used during the time that you're at war. That was the idea, right? Like you want to get people to like you or to get out of the way or whatever. So that was governed by Title 50. So that's all your war stuff. And then there were people who did defensive I/O, and that was all in the State Department. But because that was viewed as a Cold War thing, like you had to fight the propaganda of the Soviets, once the Soviets went away, you no longer needed to fight their propaganda, and so that got axed, which meant that there was no one left to have any defensive I/O capability, which meant 20 years later, when someone conducted an offensive I/O campaign during peacetime, they were literally unprepared because they had guys who didn't do I/O, but were authorized to do computer stuff. They had guys who were authorized to do things against enemy combatants, and the people that were authorized to do stuff to fight this had been out of a job or dead for 20 years, right? So this was a bureaucratic fuck-up. That's why they lost, is that they made a mistake in 1996, and 20 years later they paid for it. And that's the sort of thing that you get in cyber, where it's things that don't really appear to be critical actually are, like keeping around your defensive I/O capability from the Cold War. Gonna throw in some game theory. So one of the concepts in game theory is that there's an understanding of a game. So you can have someone who has a superficial understanding, and you'd call that like level A understanding. And then there's someone who understands it a bit better, and they'll have a deeper understanding that'll be like a level B. And then there'll be like a level C who understands it better. And the thing is, if you're a level A player versus like a level C or a D or whatever, they are going to beat you because they have a deeper understanding of the game. And this gets shortened down to K level, which is where you have a deeper understanding of how things work than your opponent. And if you have two people playing off against each other, the K level guy is going to win almost all of the time. And that's why this IO stuff became a K level, right? You had one side that didn't actually appreciate that they were in the middle of a conflict, and one side that had a very, very deep understanding of the conflict. So more about teams. We've got DRPK, who are like all about the money, but they kind of suck. And they look like this. It's basically just a bunch of dudes doing clicky-clicky. It's not very exciting. But what's interesting with them is that they are very, very focused on money, right? Which is actually a physical impact on the world, right? Like money is like a real thing that gets moved around. So even though they can do operations which appear to be just moving values in databases, you actually have to have money physically moved. Otherwise, those values in databases can get changed back. And they suck at just about every level, right? Like they're not agile, they're not adaptive, they're not very fast. They've got very, very tight cohesion, like they do exactly what the executive wants, but that's it. But they don't have a lot of creativity. They're not good at coming up with new things or adjusting to stuff. So they tend to use the same attacks over and over again. They copy what other people have innovated. They're not really an awesome team, but on the other hand, if you pick your targets, it doesn't really matter. There's China, which is one of the other teams. What's interesting about them is how they have adjusted their posture very, very well, displaying some agility. Like once things changed, they decreased their operational tempo and the volume of operations that they were engaged in. So it's kind of complicated when we're talking about China, and it's also changing because they're adapting a lot of what they do. They're trying to bring everything inward towards themselves. There's very, very loose cohesion, and the reason for this is security and deniability. So what they would do is the executive would issue a sort of broad public statement of this is our 5-year plan, and then the various groups would go out and attempt to implement that. What is most interesting about them is that they're fucking amazing at doing targeting. Their targeting is really, really good. And that is another very, very important aspect of being able to do good cyber, is to be able to pick who you attack to achieve a particular objective. Then we've got NATO, where like basically everyone is contributing something, and it's going to fall apart in no time because it is a terrible, terrible implementation. Well, it will be. So what's happening is NATO is making their own cyber center, and it is necessary for them to do that because they cannot get all of the members of NATO to share information and capacity with each other. So they have to put together their own thing, their own cyber command. The downside of that is that it's basically a giant hack me sign, and everything that they have is going to get stolen. It's pretty much as effective as moving to a bad neighborhood and then trying to scare everyone off by having a cannon in your front yard, right? Like it's like overnight the kids are going to steal the wheels and spray paint it, right? It's not going to be as effective a deterrent as you think. And the problem, of course, is that NATO, as a military organization, this is pretty much how they understand things. And that sucks because cyber is Calvin ball, right? Like it makes no fucking sense. Things that you would think work don't work, and things that shouldn't work do work, right? Like how does putting up a WordPress blog and creating a Twitter account lose an election, right? But it does. It turns out that that's literally all you need to do, right? And that makes no sense. And it's probably not going to work again, which is the other thing. It's like, you can't really expect that what worked last time is going to work the next time. And that is another factor of Calvin. So if we start winding this up now with campaigns, we can see sort of over time how stuff has changed. So there was like Operation Aurora, where the Chinese did this really, really cool stuff. If they monitored the traffic coming out of Google, they figured out that they were using IE6. They developed IE6 exploits. They popped the shell on IE6 workstations, moved from there to go over to ultimately look at the FBI requests for monitoring Gmail accounts. Because what they wanted to do is they wanted to know which spies they had in the US had been discovered by the FBI, right? And all of that was basically reported as like, oh my God, Google is dumb enough to use IE6? It's like that's, no. Like, what's amazing is that China actually decided to figure out this counterintelligence thing through this very elaborate process. And it's amazingly cool stuff. And that's a counterintelligence application of cyber. Then you have Stuxnet, where it was basically a one-shot worm that has a physical effect and kind of escaped into the wild, and things went sort of horribly wrong from there. But essentially, Stuxnet had a physical and a cognitive aspect. So the physical one is it destroyed these machines, whereas the cognitive aspect was it reported visually to the operators, everything is fine. And there's sort of, there's three lessons that came out of Stuxnet. So the lesson for the US was, we are fucking awesome and we can hit anything we want. The lessons for the Iranians was, holy shit, we got to get ourselves one of these cyber things. And the lesson for Russia was, people will believe their computers over their lying eyes, right? So it turns out that actually, if your computer says, no, the centrifuges aren't spinning out of sequence and blowing up, people believe the computers, not the blowing up centrifuges. So that's kind of interesting. And you can kind of leverage that a couple years later at, you know, an election, for example. Another campaign has been DRPK versus SWIFT, where they actually have huge amounts of dwell time on the SWIFT infrastructure before they do their transfers, because the malware that they use has embedded credentials. So they're not actually very, very swift in their attacks. The other thing is that in order for this to work, they can't simply change values in databases. They actually have to get money moved out of accounts into cache, laundered, and moved somewhere else. So you get these complicated things of like, it's very, very easy to transfer money from one account to another, but then it goes to a casino where it gets cashed out, or it gets moved into another bank account where then it gets cashed out, where then it gets driven and put in a boat and taken somewhere else. And so it's actually a lot more complicated than it appears. Another set of campaigns was the OPM, Anthem, and United hacks, which were actually conducted by different actors, but they were all contemporaneous, and they were all done by the same, like they were China, basically. So the thing is, it was all of these different ways of getting information about people, putting it together and building up a sort of private Facebook of the US government, right? Pretty much everyone in the US government gets their healthcare from Anthem. Everyone that had clearance went through OPM, except for people who worked for CIA. And they all flew out of Dulles on United, because that was what they had an arrangement with, the airliner. So by putting all of this information together, you could learn a huge amount about people. And this is targeting, and it's fucking awesome stuff. And then Gusoff 2 would be another campaign. And Gusoff 2 was a purely cognitive campaign. So it was the use of basically just existing data that was given out to people. And that in itself was enough to be an attack. And the fact that it was created in less than 12 hours, or sorry, like less than 24 hours, about 12 hours or so, is again amazing. And it's the sort of thing you can do only if you have the bureaucratic space for maneuver. So That's been an absolutely whirlwind tour of cyber. And finally, let's see, because cyber is Calvin ball, you can't just copy what worked in the last war because it's not going to work in the next war, which means that the US fixation right now with information operations is bound to fail because that was the last war and they lost it. And the next war is going to be something else. And if you're getting really, really excited and involved with whatever the last tactic was, you're going to miss the next one that comes up. NATO is going to get wrecked. They really have no choice. They have to do what they're doing, and I understand that. But I also think it is not a good idea to put all of your eggs in one basket. China is doing this very interesting thing where it's pulling everything inwards, like it used to be expansive, going out, sucking things from other people. Now they've switched, and they've probably decided that they've reached a level of competency that they no longer need to go out and take from other people. They need to say, all right, if you want to do stuff, come here, do it in here. The US is really, really good at developing technology and really, really bad at exploiting it. Right? They don't know how to take what they have and adapt it and use it in a weaponized form. The other thing that's going to come up, I think, next is probably going to be blended ops. And blended ops is where you recruit someone in the organization that you're attacking, or you get someone hired to work there. And this is not the insider threat that we all get told about, watch out for your ignorant CFO who's going to click on anything, or beware the disgruntled sysadmin who's going to do stuff. This is where someone who is actually trained, motivated, and malicious and works inside your company. And I think blended ops is going to be the next cool thing that everyone does. And that's going to be quite interesting. And so I have absolutely no idea how you're going to stop that. But I'm sure vendors will figure out some way to make you pay for it. So, thank you. Any questions? We good? No? Normally in Asia, people love to ask questions. I'm really surprised. Cool. All right, thanks. Oh. Yep. Mm-hmm. Right. So the question is, even though we know all about the influence ops, but what about whether any votes were actually changed? And to be honest, I think the only answer anyone can give is I don't know, because vote security on those voting machines is so terrible that there's literally no way of verifying whether the vote tallies that were submitted or that were counted by the devices actually reflect what the voters chose. So there's no way of knowing. I would tend to think that they didn't do it because Obama warned them that that was like the red line, which was dumb because the red line was actually anything at all. He picked this thing as his don't do it. And so I think that they backed off and decided, all right, we won't do that itself. We'll come up to the point, but not over it, because part of Russian doctrine is to remain at a threshold just below actual retaliation. So I suspect it didn't happen, but there's literally no way of knowing because there's no way of actually knowing. All those machines suck. They're Windows 2000 boxes. Right. We're good? Because I think everyone wants to go and drink coffee. I know I do. So, all right. Thank you.
Hey, I want to thank the Grugq for a truly fascinating talk. He is going to be available for questions just outside of this room if you have anything you'd like to chat with him about. This concludes our keynote program today. Please enjoy the rest of your day at Black Hat. Thank you.